Hi, my name is Bibek Adhikari. I am an English instructor. In today's class, we are going to solve the writing portion of Unit 15, that is, uses of passive voice. So, let's begin. Alright, in this class, we shall talk about passive voice, when to use it and when to avoid it. So, before starting that, let's discuss what passive voice is. So, the first question that is commonly asked is, what is passive voice? The answer to that question is, in English, all sentences are either in active voice or passive voice, but that's, a premise. Now let's talk about those two voices. We have active voice, then we have the passive voice. All the sentences in English are either in active voice or in passive voice. For example, Einstein formulated E equals mc square, and the passive to that is E equals mc square was formulated by Einstein. Let's look at the tenses. In the first one we have a past tense, simple past tense, and in passive voice we have a be verb followed by V3. So in an active sentence, the person or thing, responsible for the action in the sentence comes first. Who's responsible for finding E equals mc square? Einstein is. So Einstein comes first. Whereas in a passive voice, the person or thing acted on comes first, and the actor is added at the end, introduced with the preposition by. So what was formulated by Einstein? E equals mc square was formulated, and we have added the preposition by. The passive form of the verb is signaled by a form of to be. In the sentence above, was formulated is in passive voice, while formulated is in active voice. Once again, I'm repeating that. Was formulated is in a passive voice, while formulated is an active voice. In a passive sentence, we often omit the actor completely. For example, we can say something like E equals mc square was formulated. We don't necessarily have to say by Einstein, because it's a known fact. Everybody knows that, Einstein formulated E equals mc square. So we can simply say E equals mc square was formulated, and the sentence would still be correct. Now that we know what passive voice is, we shall now talk about when to use the passive voice. When to use the passive voice. In some sentences, passive voice can be perfectly acceptable. You might use it in the following cases. The first is, the actor is unknown. We don't know who did the work. So in that case, we can use passive voice. For example, the cave paintings of Lascaux were made in the Upper Old Stone Age. So were made, we have a be verb, to be verb followed by V3. And why do we do that? The answer is obvious, because we don't know who made them. That is why the actor is unknown. So who's the actor who made those stone paintings, cave paintings? We don't know. The actor is unknown. That is why we use the passive voice. Instead of saying, somebody made the cave paintings, we say the cave paintings were made. By whom? We don't know. Second use is, the actor is irrelevant. The actor is irrelevant, right? So in this case, for example, an experimental solar power plant will be built in the Australian desert. So where's the passive voice? Here's the passive voice. We have to be form followed by a V3, right? So why do we use passive voice in this case? Simply because we are not interested in who is building. Simply because we are not interested in who is building it, right? We don't care. The actor is irrelevant, that is what we mean. So an experimental solar power plant will be built in the Australian desert. It will be built by somebody, of course. That is quite obvious, but we don't care about that person, right? So that is why we use passive voice. And if you were to change this sentence into active voice, you would say something like, a group of scientists will build an experimental solar power plant in the Australian desert. That is how you would write. We didn't really care about, this group of scientists. We thought they were grammatically irrelevant. They cannot be irrelevant otherwise. They are very significant in real life. I am talking about grammar, and grammatically, these people, grammar thought, or at least we thought, are irrelevant. And that is why we used the passive voice. Let's go to the third use. You want to be vague about who is responsible. So this is the case. You want to be vague about who is responsible. Now you've got to use the passive voice. For example, mistakes were made. So mistakes were made. We have a be verb followed by V3. Who made the mistakes? We don't know. We don't care about those people, right? That's why we're using passive voice. You want to be vague about who is responsible. Who is responsible for these mistakes? Somebody asked. And you say, I don't know, because this is quite diplomatic kind of writing. A lot of bureaucratic writing focuses are written like this. So we don't know who made the mistake, or we are rather being irresponsible about who's responsible for making the mistake. Now the fourth use is you are talking about a general truth. And whenever you're talking about a general truth, you use the passive voice. For example, rules are made to be broken. Rules are made to be broken. We have again, sorry, not there, here, B plus V3. This is perfectly active voice. Well, this is the passive voice. So we don't care by whomever or whenever, whatsoever, right? We care about one thing, and that is rules are made to be broken. By whom, when, how, we don't care. That's why we use the passive voice. Now let's go to the fifth use. You wanted to emphasize the person or thing acted on. So you want to emphasize on the person or thing that is acted on. For example, insulin was first discovered in 1921 by researchers at University of Toronto. It is still the only treatment available for diabetes, right? Insulin. So what is the main focus? Insulin. You wanted to emphasize the person or thing acted upon. You want to emphasize this thing called insulin. So you use was discovered, that is be verb followed by V3 again. That is why you use the passive voice, because you want to focus on the object. You want to focus on the thing or the person that is acted upon. Your whole focus in this sentence is upon insulin. That is why you say insulin was first discovered in 1921 by researchers at the University of Toronto. You don't say something like, researchers at the University of Toronto first discovered insulin in 1921. That is a fine sentence, if you ask me, but you don't use that. Why do you do that? Because we are emphasizing a person or thing. That is why insulin should be kept in the beginning of the sentence. Now the sixth use is you're writing a scientific paper or an academic essay. So let's say you're writing an academic essay, or maybe you're writing a scientific paper. The thing is, passive voice is often preferred in lab reports and scientific research papers, most notably in the materials and method section. So you'll know, if you study science, you write something like this: the sodium hydroxide was discovered. No, I don't mean discovered. I mean was dissolved in water. This solution was then titrated with hydrochloric acid. So this is an example. You are writing a scientific paper and you wrote something like this: the sodium hydroxide, which is NaOH, the sodium hydroxide was dissolved in water, right? H2O simply. This solution was titrated with hydrochloric acid. So this is a normal titration reaction. So in titration reaction, the base is reacted with acid, and chemical reaction takes place, and we find the point of titration, and from there we find the strength, normally the normality or molarity of the acid or base. Phew, that is all science. We are not talking science, we are talking literature. So in scientific papers, we care about passive voice. And what is the passive voice? We have a be verb followed by a V3. We again have a be verb followed by V3. See, this is the use of passive voice. In these sentences, you can count on your reader to know that you are the one who did the dissolving and titrating. The passive voice places the emphasis on your experiment rather than you. Now comes the big question: when to avoid passive voice? A lot of writers, they don't really like writing in passive voice, they try to avoid passive voice. Now I'm going to teach you when to do that. Passive sentences can get you in trouble in academic writing because they can be vague about who is responsible for the action. For example, if you write something like this, both Othello and Iago desire Desdemona. She is courted. Now let's say this is the sentence, right? Both Othello and Iago, these are two characters from Shakespeare's famous play called Othello. So both Othello and Iago, they desire Desdemona. And Desdemona is courted. I mean, who courted? Like, who courts Desdemona? Is it Othello, Iago, both of them? We don't know. So we ask an impending question. Who's courting Desdemona? You see, this is the problem with passive voice. Academic writing often focuses on differences between the ideas of different researchers or between your ideas and those of the researchers you are discussing. So, if you say something like research has been done, who did the research? You? Is it you or your professor or another person? So we don't know, That is why we need to avoid passive. Finally, passive sentences often sound wordy and indirect. They sound wordy and they sound indirect. They can make the reader work unnecessarily hard. And since they are usually longer than active sentences, passive sentences take a precious room in your paper. When you write something like, since the car was being driven by Michael at the time of the accident, the damages should be paid for him now, God. Such a clumsy sentence, you see. That's why try to avoid passive whenever necessary. Now the thing is how to weed out passive. Weeding out passive. So we're going to weed out the passive structure and how to do that. So if you now use a lot of passive sentences, you may not be able to catch all the problematic cases in your first draft, but you can still go back through your essay hunting specifically for the passive sentences. At first, you may want to ask for your help with your writing teacher. The grammar checker in your word processor can help find passive sentences, but not all the time, you see. Now, let me give you one example. Poland was invaded in 1939, thus initiating World War II. So Poland was invaded in 1939, thus initiating World War II. How can you turn this sentence into active? You need to write something like Germany invaded Poland in 1939, thus initiating which war? World War II. You see, turning each passive sentence, you will find one active sentence. So the active sentence is always shorter. Look at the passive sentence and look at the active sentence. Poland was invented. We have a be verb followed by V3. In 1939, thus initiating World War III. Germany invaded. We simply have a V2. Less wordy, less clumsy, better. Reads better this active sentence. You don't believe me? Let me give you one more example. Genetic information is encoded by DNA. Genetic information is encoded by DNA. How can you convert this into active? You would write something like DNA encodes genetic information. See the difference? Is encoded, we have a be verb followed by V3. We simply have a V5 here. And if this is the passive voice while this is the active voice, and if you read both of the voices, you will find that this active voice is shorter, is better, and is efficient, and is even easy to read. Rather than saying genetic information is encoded by DNA, you can simply say DNA encodes genetic information. Rather than saying the possibility of cold fusion has been examined for many years, you can say something like physicists have examined the possibility of cold fusion for many years. You see? So this is how you avoid, or rather weed out, the passive voice. Now let me give you some homework. Homework time. And here's your homework. Think about the changes that have been made in your village for the past 5 years. Write a paragraph about that using the passive voice. So this is your homework, all right? All you have to do is think about the changes that have been made in your village for the past 5 years. Now write a paragraph about that using passive voice. I taught you the different uses of passive voice. I taught you how to use passive voice and when to use passive voice and when to not use passive voice. I also taught you how to weed out passive voice. Now with all due respect to passive voice and its uses, all you have to do is write a paragraph about the changes that you have seen in your village for the past 5 years in a paragraph. Alright, that is the end of today's class. If you have any questions or suggestions regarding these video series, feel free to write us at learning@deerwalk.edu.np. Thank you.